Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the public lecture To Queer or Not to Queer, a non-normative approach to curating by Goran Pavlić, which is a part of the collaborative program by Lokomotiva and Skopje Pride Weekend this year, organized in the frame of the first edition of the International Summer School, which is named Curating in Context. My name is Biljana Tanurovska, and I'm co-curator of the school together with my colleague Slavko Dimitrov, who will moderate the discussion after the lecture. Just I will give few words before we start about the school. That it's a part of the project with the same title. It's a 2-year project, which is supported by Erasmus Plus program, which is co-organized between 2 NGOs. One is Tanzfabrik Berlin and Lokomotiva Skopje, and 2 higher educational institutions, Stockholm University of the Arts and University of Zagreb, from where also Goran Pavlić comes. And the aim of this project was to respond, or is to respond to the challenges that the growing influence of the concepts of curating and curatorial pose in the contemporary art field, beyond the sphere of visual arts. So during 2 years, we are planning to develop different meetings, public events, various resources that will thematize collaborative learning approaches through curating between politics and policies, and the valorization of art with the greater goal of manifesting the impact of cultural and civil sector on society. However, the school we developed with the aim to critically reflect and address different socio-political economic contexts, and also to develop curatorial methods, let's say, in order to rethink the practices of performing art in relation to social movements, self-organization, activism, artivism, etc., and in the dialogue of contemporary critical theories and transdisciplinary studies. We have 18 international participants this year. Different types of program is organized with seminars, workshops, etc. And we have 2 public programs. One is this lecture with Goran, and the next one is going to be on 7th September, Monday, a public discussion with colleagues from the region, Marijana Cvetković, Jasna Žmak, Rok Vevar, and Jasmina Založnik. And that's it from me. I would like to thank only my colleagues who work on the summer school, Violeta Kačakova and Zorica Zafirovska, as well as Jana Dimitrov as volunteer of Lokomotiva, and also for the support of Ministry of Culture that this year supported also this summer school curating in context. So now I will leave and disappear and leave Slavko to introduce Goran and moderate the lecture.
Thank you, Biljana. It is my pleasure that we are doing jointly, as for many years now, this lecture as part both of the program of Kino Kultura and also the Skopje Pride Weekend, or actually Lokomotiva and the Skopje Pride Weekend, and that we have Goran with us. His lecture fitted perfectly with the entire concept of the festival as well, which actually deals with queer art, cultural and theoretical practices, but also in political practices, and mingles together not only art and cultural practices, but also a lot of theoretical discussions, lectures, and opening questions and problems that are related to queer politics, queer identities, but also this year curating and how can we queer curating, which is a topic that Goran's lecture deals with. Goran is a professor for all those following us. Just short info before I give the floor to Goran. Goran is a professor at the Academy of Dramatic Arts in Zagreb, and his work deals with questions related to political, in the fields of political theory, performance studies and performance theory, political economy of arts, and problems which also are dealt with in his several published books, including the political economy of Miroslav Krleža, Glembajevi dual reading, but also his first book in 2011, Space of Identity in the Performing Sphere, and his co-edited volume with Petleski, Teatrum Mundi, Interdisciplinary Perspectives from 2010. 2015. In today's lecture, Goran will try to problematize and explore the political possibilities of the concept and practices of queer and queerness, try to expand the concept beyond the academic confines of understanding what queerness is and the complexity of queer experiences, and to also tackle problems related to curating marginal spaces or spaces related to marginalized cultural practices. What I find interesting, and I would like to hear Goran also to speak about, would be also his queer Marxist approach or his materialist approach to the problem of curating marginal cultural practices. Finally, Goran will address and will propose alternative epistemological stances that deal with communities that depart or are in excess of normative, standard and hegemonic social frames and institutions. So I wouldn't like to take any longer. Goran, I would invite you and thank you once again, also in my name and in the name of the festival, for joining us on this occasion and agreeing to be part also of our program. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Slavcho, and thank you, Biljana, for inviting me here to present some insights or some thoughts, some remarks on the problems that tackle both of these mentioned spheres. There is the, let's say, queer movement and or queer theory, and on the other hand, curating, especially non-institutional curating outside the well-established apparatuses. That is curating in the field that we call the public sphere or civil society or social movements. In introductory words, Slavcho mentioned and stressed all the main points that I put forth in my abstract, and I hope I'll manage to really tackle them all with particular accent on some of the most urgent problems that I find relevant in this try or attempt to connect or to intersperse the two pretty diverse fields such as queer movements and queer theory, and on the other hand, curatorial field and curating. First of all, I would like to put forth a disclaimer, and this is that I'm neither a queer theorist and nor curator. And this is not an excuse for the words to come, but just kind of a warning for those of you who have more experience or are more well-versed into the queer theory. This is not going to be an expertise in particular minutiae or details of queer theory, neither polemics with ever-growing field of curatorial studies, of curating studies, of art history as applied to curatorial field, which is very propulsive now, which have so many contributions from so many perspectives. So there are many philosophers, curators, artists engaged in these polemics, and it's still going on. So my attempt here is only to tackle some of the most pressing issues that I find relevant in this approach that tries to combine theoretical insights from queer theory in order to resolve or to, maybe too ambitiously, but to improve some of the polemics that take place now in the curatorial spheres, in the curatorial discourse. Although I'm not expert in any of these fields, I am actually quite experienced in both of them, and I mean this in the virtue of activist. I've been part as an activist and partaker in the queer movement in Zagreb from the very beginnings, some 20 years ago, in times when just going on the pride marches was actually a life-threatening experience with lots of hurt people. Fortunately, no one got killed, but all these events were highly full of tensions. The watching of the queer movies was in cinema theaters that were guarded by heavily armed soldiers. Literally, the situations you may see, I don't know, in post-apocalyptic movies. So like 5 people go into cinema and there are 5 heavily armed with automatic weapons, soldiers actually protecting us not to get killed or something. And this is not just some possibly interesting moments that I bring on from my experience. They will, I suppose, be extremely relevant in forming a particular approach to the issue of applicability of queer theory to the matter of actually existing material dynamics in the curatorial field. On the other side, I'm not curator as well, but I collaborate with curatorial collective Block from Zagreb, who they're non-governmental organization, not an institution, and they stand in firm opposition towards the statist or administrative institutions that deal with art. So they engage in work mainly in participatory art with excluded communities like elder people, minorities, movements, organizations that deal with feminism, that deal with queer issues, and try to articulate particular and autonomous stance of treating these issues in artistic way, albeit with heavy theoretical tools, so to say. So on the intersection of these two spheres, there is curating that is non-institutional and queer movements that is, again, pretty far from official academic or art institution, at least in Croatia. I'll try to find some of the entry points to deal with some of the issues that we find in everyday practice. Kevin Floyd, American philosopher and one of the most notable queer theorists, in his book, in his now already classical book, Reification of Desire, quotes Marx concerning the importance of the very practice on the formation of theory. I quote here Floyd. The concrete is not the empirically given. To comprehend the concrete in its complexity, the thinking subject has to engage in a certain practice of abstraction. This subject has to distill in thought, in conceptual form, the concrete's constitutive determinations, and only through this process can the concrete be theoretically reconstructed with anything resembling validity. Even, end of quote, even people who are not familiar with Marxist theory know that the many pupils, many followers, many Marxists didn't actually follow and didn't stand up to the principles and insights of the founder of Marxism, that is Marx. And in this case, this is more obvious. So a lot of actual concrete dynamics in social development in different periods of time throughout the 20th century and even up to in 21st century did not take into account some of the aspects of the social dynamics because they were decried as not sufficiently relevant, as something that happens on the margins, something that is not crucial for understanding capitalism. In Floyd's approach, and what I'm trying to do as well, is exactly opposite, to engage with those minoritarian practices, to engage in this everyday experience, which can inform us and help us to develop more precise or more apt theoretical tools for understanding the contemporary logic of capitalism as a system and as a system of economical production and reproduction, but as well as a system of strict regulation of personal identities. So my presentation here is going to be, it actually consists of two main parts. The first one is exhibiting problems with queer theory as seen from the Marxist point of view. And I'm going to apply here mainly Floyd's insights by Kevin Floyd and Judith Butler, probably the most distinguished queer scholar still living. And in the second half, I'm going to apply these insights or these critical points, these critical ruptures to curating practices and curating or curatorial discourse that develops around curating practices, which has been a really intensive dynamics in the last 10 years. So to start with queerness of curating. First of all, although I'm not familiar and I'm not fond of, and I don't like the etymology as a method of explanation, probably because of my traumas with Heideggerian philosophy, who always stick to the etymology and try to disclose this kind of hidden meaning below the very word. In this case, and consulting the official dictionary, I think it's instructive to see how can the very etymology help us see some of the problematic aspects of queerness. So first of all, when we look up in the dictionary.com, and that is probably the most reliable internet source for English language because it's a platform made out of many very distinguished instances like Oxford Institute for Language and so on and so on. So we take their definitions to be really reliable and exact as much as possible. When you enter the queer, you get the following results. First, queer as adjective, which means 1, strange or odd from a conventional viewpoint, unusually different, singular, and 2, of a questionable nature or character. Both these characterizations or definitions have more than obvious moralistic tone. There is something problematic with it. There is a conventional viewpoint, and that which is queer is somehow odd or unusually different, or even more so, of questionable nature or character. Furthermore, we have verb to queer that I used in my title, and it means to spoil or to ruin. Again, moralistic overtone. So we have this kind of healthy and normal, or we may say natural situation, which is somehow threatened from beside, from this queer perspective. And it can be spoiled, it can be ruined exactly by those instances that are of questionable nature or character. And this implies the following. There is something conventional or normal that characterizes our everyday functioning in the world. And this normal is seriously challenged by queer. I'd like to point here to the definition which I find brilliant, and it is expressed by French sociologist Émile Durkheim, the founder of sociology actually, who gave this definition, which is brilliant in its neutral character. And it is as follows. The normal is something that is statistically prevalent. So there's no intrinsic value in normal. There's no some kind of firm set of characteristics that we would treat as normal and that could be endangered or threatened by something that is no normal. It's only the quality of massive support. So when majority of people hold something to be truth or evident or natural or right or morally right, it is only so by virtue of being held or supported by majority. There is nothing intrinsic in it that could justify its naming right, true, or so. This Durkheim's definition implies very strictly that there is always a power game in these situations, because a group of people, majority of people, is capable or is in a situation, is in a capacity to enforce their beliefs, their truths, their conceptions of normal, of beautiful, of decent, of natural, of whatever, to the minorities. In this situation, the minority is always like a small scapegoat, a threatening factor. There has been numerous instances in history that we're not going to name here, when the minorities were treated as the main source of evil. Of course, we know the tragic destiny of Jewish people who were throughout the centuries always accused of producing some kind of evil to the healthy and normal and homogeneous Christian community. Situation in Muslim countries were pretty different, but that's not the point. The point is that this dynamic between the majority population and the minorities, it's always a political one. It always tackles power, and it always presupposes a strong asymmetry in this power. That is, one group has pretty big or enormous power, the other has very little or none. This situation, of course, challenges throughout time. The political conditions change, and especially in this context, the queer people have witnessed in the last 30 or 40 years of its existence how much did the situation, at least in Western countries, improved, in how many aspects have theoretical contributions from queer theorists and from critical theorists managed to soften or to challenge or to question the normalcy of usual attitudes, of usual natural facts, of usual attitudes towards the people, towards the world, and in the final case, towards the art. This queer aspect, this abnormal, or as dictionary says, aspects of questionable nature can spoil or ruin that which is normal. And this is, I think, especially valuable, since it is necessary to ruin some evident truths and facts to advance and develop. So the starting question, that is the main question of my presentation, is how does that which spoils or ruins in this context queer movement and queer theory actually contribute or advance the theory of curating? And by theory, I mean systematic account and not only academic discipline. Of course, usually when saying theory, we think of academic apparatus, that is books and libraries and professors and teachers and courses and faculties or whatever that work on and develop the theory. But theory is being produced even on the margins, even on the very frails of the society. And the history of queer movement and of queer theory is especially illustrative of this. Many theoreticians were not even acknowledged as such up until a few years ago, although they were writing these issues for the last 30 years or so. Mario Mieli or even Kevin Floyd were not acknowledged as great theoreticians, contributed to the severe questioning of the existing capitalist order, but they were thought as some kind of small range theoreticians of some marginal practices. The fact that their work is now acknowledged and recognized as a serious contribution to the social theory is one of the proofs or one of the evidences that situation is getting better, although it is far from being good or great. So these theoretical productions, non-institutional theoretical productions that I point out are extremely relevant because they give this kind of knowledge that is almost in principle impossible to create within the boundaries of the academic disciplines. We all in general, we know that there are very strict boundaries between academically produced knowledge and non-academically produced knowledge. And that which is produced outside of the academy has way more problems with legitimacy, has way more problems to achieve or to reach the mainstream audience and to be treated serious. The history of all human sciences is filled with such perspectives which took a very long time to become a legitimate part of official discourse, but queer theory, in today's case, the most relevant example, had to go through this for more than 40 years now, from the first works of Michel Foucault in the late 70s, and then through Judith Butler in the 90s, through all the really queer theoreticians or strictly queer theoreticians of 2000s, to gain the public recognition and to start being included in the university curricula and to start being published by main publishers in the field. So this dynamics is, again, all about power. It's not some kind of innocent state of affairs which was God-given or which is natural. So it's always about the capacity of one group of people to impose or to exert power over the others. And queer theory in its rise from the gutters to the stars, so whatever metaphor we use, is extremely illustrative of these dynamics. So that's one of the reasons why I find it extremely challenging to try to think curatorial or curating practices with some of the concepts that were developed or that were improved and recontextualized within the field of queer theory. So my main argument about the importance of queer theory is based, as I already said earlier, on the insights of Kevin Floyd from his work Reification of Desire and from Judith Butler's paper Merely Cultural from 1997. Floyd strongly draws on Butler's insights, although he's more engaged, as those of you who may have seen the book and skipped through the pages, he mostly deals with Jameson and Georg Lukács, two of the greatest Marxian or Marxist philosophers of art and philosophers of social dynamics of art, so to say. It's not too precise, but we're not going to go into these details. I just want to stress some of the important aspects, some of the really brilliant micro incisions that Floyd puts, which can open a productive and fruitful approach to the field of curating. Floyd, as many theoreticians before him, writing in the early 2000s, the book is from 2009, detects a blindness of Marxism to queer issues from the emergence of queer movement in the 80s. Small digression here, for those of you who may not have seen it, I strongly suggest the British movie Pride about this movement called Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, with Mark Ashton as a leading figure, who at the beginning of the 80s, actually in 84, started to support the miners in strike by acknowledging the necessary relation between exclusion of workers from the mainstream dynamics of British society and exclusion of minorities. While some of the queer movement was dedicated to, let's say, more queer stuff, to queer stuff, to the problems of identity, self-identification, recognition of personal identity, Ashton and the crowd around him stood directly from the very beginning in support of the miners, recognizing the fact that both the exclusion of both minorities, it's slightly improper to speak of workers as minorities, but as a group that is excluded from the mainstream capitalist dynamics, that the similar or analogous mechanisms of exclusions are present in this police violence against workers, as was earlier deployed against queer minorities, that is against queer movement. So in this movie, The Pride, the situation is masterful, actually elaborated and presented, and it's, according to the critics, it's really fair depiction of the dynamics that was going on in these years. So this instance and many more, some of them are stressed by Floyd and some are not, but from the very beginning of queer movements, the problematic of queerness was not so isolated as some from the Marxist standpoint decried. It's not that all participants of queer movements were only dedicated to the problems of their sexual identity, although that is true for most of them, but there were also many of them who tried to systematically comprehend the capitalist dynamics and to see in what ways are all the exclusionary dynamics connected. That is, exclusion of non-white races or of non-white people, exclusion, so women, exclusion of disabled people, and in these days now pretty prevalent, exclusion of trans people and the problem that trans people meet when advocating for their basic human rights. These minoritarian or marginal problems are Floyd claims, and I agree, are not marginal at all. They do partake in some of the crucial and central processes that constitute the capitalist system. And through Floyd's and Butler's arguments, we'll see how does that happen. There are 2 points through which Floyd tries to found a common ground for queer theory and Marxism. Since they were pretty divorced, he tries somehow in the role of a mediator to find the common ground, and not only in this act of conciliation, but as a possible productive hybrid for analyzing the capitalist system. So he marks the 2 aspects, and I'm going to choose only one of these. These 2 aspects are totality and reification. Totality, I'm not going to talk about reification because it would take a lot of time and it would go into different problems in queer theory. But with totality, main problem is, as Floyd sees it, that Marxism possesses this totalizing ambition, which often then deprioritizes secondary issues, such as sexuality or race or gender identity or physical or physical ableism to participate in a society in a way which is prohibited to non-able persons or disabled persons. Treating those identities or treating those minoritarian practices as merely cultural, even progressives in the Marxist field like Ellen Maxine Wood or Nancy Fraser treat economy as crucial site of political antagonism in capitalism, while all the other spheres of social regulation are secondary. In other words, economic inequality is essential for capitalism to thrive, while the other inequalities can coexist with capitalism. This is not necessarily so. History of capitalism is very versatile. It includes many instances where, like slavery, where without subjugation of people from Africa, it wouldn't be possible to develop. So even on the historical and not only on theoretical level, these accusations that race or sexuality or being able is something that can be put on the secondary place is pretty doubtful. But on a theoretical level, it's even more important to question this self-evident truth that reigns within the Marxist fields, and as I said, even among those who are most progressive in the field. Floyd stresses that sexuality in capitalism is not merely a domain of pleasure and of procreation, such as is usually understood, but that this sexuality functions as a system, actually functions as an instance which questions the system of natural order. That is, sexuality is not to be treated as some kind of trait that can characterize particular minorities or particular groups of people. It is, Floyd suggests, at the very core of the capitalist system, this naturalization of heterosexual nuclear family. That is, whatever eschews this standard, whatever functions not according to the rules of this heterosexual reproduction is not just a marginal or irrelevant aspect or relevant just for cultural studies. It's actually stands at the core of capitalist reproduction. We'll see this referring to the Butler's insights, who are partly incorporated into Floyd's arguments from her paper Merely Cultural from 1997, so it's 12 years before Floyd. She engages in this paper in a polemics with some of her opponents. She does it implicitly, she doesn't name any of the names, but for those of us who were old enough to read and to study theory at that time, we may be more familiar with this denunciation from the Marxist standpoint that queer theoreticians are merely satirics, that they produce them, especially Judith Butler, theory of parody, and that they're not actually engaged into substantial material transformation of society, but just merely joking actually, and having some fun in provoking with some slight and mild provocations the very firm foundations of capitalist society. Butler, as well as Floyd, that is, she was the first to do so, denounces tendency in Marxism to dismiss new social movements as merely cultural, hence the title, and therefore the object only of cultural studies and not a general theory of social totality. In this totalizing perspective, claims Butler, there is a firm division between the cultural and material life, and it is not so stable and firm as purported by the real Marxist. That is, the traditional Marxist perspective, and many scholars have pointed this out, always somehow prefers and prioritizes the heavy industry and as basis, and everything else is, as well known, superstructure. This kind of perspective was seriously challenged and I would say even destroyed in the 70s and in the 80s in the works of Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson and Ellen Maxine Wood, but it still persists in some Marxist circles, obviously, because Floyd deals with it again in 2009, because this kind of self-evident truth that there's industry at the core of every societal system, and then there are other less significant aspects, still persist. Fun enough, but it does. Those authors, and Butler among them, stress that culture is always material, and it is material not only because it produces some material objects, which is obvious, but it organizes and shapes the modes of living and of the production of living. And the famous example is the leisure, or this dimension of human reproduction that goes on beyond work. So people work for a particular amount of hours per day and per year, and they have some free time, and in this free time they do something. These actions and these activities are not merely cultural assets. And the famous example, famous widely used example, is the difference between golf and local bar. So people who hang around in local bar usually go there by foot. Their ecological imprint is very low. They spend fairly small amount of money. They drink. They may produce some violence, but generally their general economic output is very low. They spend not much money, and the state is not so interested in this type of actions. On the other side, there is a golf, also a leisure activity, also a recreational activity, which is also performed and practiced outside of the job, although something that many jobs are settled there, but nevertheless. But in order to produce a golf facility, that is a golf course, you need to have a strong urbanistic planning, which gives a lot of urban space to the golf course, that is to the investors. The ecological output is, the ecological imprint is extremely high because it takes extreme lot of water and pesticides to keep those golf courses neat and trim. And people usually use their vehicles to go there because you don't have in your backyard the golf course. So although both these cultural activities are part of everyday experience of humans on Earth or within a particular state or city or whatever, one of them engages a lot of economic power, a lot of economic dynamics, and the other one almost none. This may seem trivial or peripheral, but it is a good contrast to see how something that is decried as merely cultural, as not relevant, can employ so much finance and effort and work and corruption and whatever, just to satisfy someone's cultural needs. There are billions of other examples, let's say football and the infrastructure to build football stadium, or even more so Formula One, the so-called sport, which is basically a TV spectacle invented by Bernie Sanders, which also needs extremely big amounts of money to function, but it is treated as some kind of leisure or cultural trait. So to sum it up and to put it neatly, this denunciation of some activities or of some practices as cultural, be it their leisure time or sexual identities or practices of organizing everyday life, are always included in the reproduction of life, and that is in reproduction of capitalism according to some rules posed by the dominant ideology of the time. But stresses Butler, and this is important, these new political formations such as queer movements or any minoritarian movement are not discrete units, neither ideologically nor organizationally. They overlap, they co-determine each other, they converge and diverge on particular issues. Therefore, new social movements, especially queer movement, ruin or spoil, as we said earlier, this pretension to homogeneity. But more important, they ruin the natural order by demonstrating diversity or non-identity at the core of every social group. That is, in other words, all the natural things that we are taught through our educational system, or that we take for granted, or that we take are part of the common sense, are based on the pretense that there is a homogeneous unity in a particular group. The radical transformatory potential in queer movement is exactly questioning this naturalness. By the very virtue of its existence, it demonstrates that there's something else beside this natural. That is, that there are more natural things that the purported natural order or natural relations seem to acknowledge as existing. By the very fact that the queer movement is here, that it seeks recognition as a legitimate part of human experience, it questions this normality of capitalist heterosexual system, which is ideological construct and not a natural phenomenon. And so Butler claims, and this is along the lines with recently published analysis of misogyny by Kate Manning, but 20 years earlier, Butler claims homophobia is not just a personal distaste for or towards gay people. This sentiment probably exists among some people in the majority, but this is not crucial. The crucial is that this is a regulative regime of systemic reproduction. Only if we exclude gay people or queer people in wider sense, queer people, from this mainstream, this natural or normal mainstream, are we able to pretend that the capitalism is normal, that it is a natural system, and that all the other alternatives are at least questionable, if not impossible? So many decrying of requests for the transformation of existing society are met with the same arguments, but this is natural. People are greedy, people love to have many things. This is their natural proclivity. Therefore, we must have capitalism. Therefore, all the quests for a different societal organization are just kind of lunacy or something. This is particularly relevant for any kind of social activist circles, because any kind of quest can be met with this famous phrasing from Margaret Thatcher, Tina, or there is no alternative. You may ask for this and that, but the business logic is only thing that is real, only thing that is natural, and in this naturalness, it dictates all other aspects of normalcy. And one of these is heterosexuality as normal. state of affairs and queer sexualities as somehow abnormal or of questionable character. And to sum up this part, I take queer movement as a direct threat to the normality of capitalism, insofar as it demonstrates its contingent, arbitrary nature, which prioritizes one's over other social groups. The very material existence, its practices and customs shed particular light on the analogous procedures in normal life, and that's how they become epistemologically crucial. In different words, by stressing these abnormal, marginal aspects, we manage to enter or to get to the new aspects of knowledge, to the new procedure of knowing that were hitherto hidden, because this purported normalcy prevented our reflexive endeavors in this sense. And this is not a speculative thesis. We know that only by developing on queer theory, so many aspects of heterosexual culture were discovered and decried as not normal, but as contingent, as the result of particular games of power. And before that, it was theoretical, almost not impossible, but not probable that they will be highlighted enough. So to get to the curating issues and to see how does this intervention of queer theory into questioning of normalcy can be applied to the field of curating. In his paper from 2019, Felix Vogel offers an overview of the current state of theory into the curatorial field. He's pretty critical about a lot of tendencies and about a lot of practices, but what I find interesting and instructive here is some of his stresses and some of his emphasis on the particular dynamics in this curatorial field. He quotes Maria Lind, or via Maria Lind, he presents some of the concepts which distinguish strictly between curating and curatorial. And his employment of Maria Lind I find inspirational, because it states that curating to curatorial is like ontic to ontological is in Heidegger, or like relation between politics and political in Chantal Mouffe's work on the political. While curating is merely the practice of curating, that may be programming or mediating or reflecting or whatever, on the very side of the artistic event, the curatorial with big C encompasses critique, editing, education, and fundraising. That is, it's instilled into every aspect of production of art, not only in the direct production of the artwork, but as in the production of art as a system. Therefore, it is not strange or not unexpectable for curator to be a successful or competent fundraiser, to be educator, to be faculty professor, to be at the same time to write artistic criticism, to edit volumes, to publish papers. So many different aspects of art world are now somehow situated into one instance, and that is the position of curator. The curatorial would be this type of discourse which questions and which exhibits those tensions between the mere act of curating, that is the practical field, and all these aspects that curatorial presupposes or includes. While curating in these perspectives represents curatorial presence, that is, it performs something by the very virtue of its coming into being. And Vogel stresses this fact, although he questions it, but this is not important for us. So distinction between presentation and representation. Representation is, in these views, traditional. Its characteristics characteristic for the traditional art world, and presentation is something that got on the world stage only in the 60s, but truly developed in the 90s and 2000s. Curating versus curatorial is therefore the essential contradiction of the field of curatorial studies or curatorial discourse. In other words, the curatorial discourse cannot function by neglecting this tension. It is, so to say, forced to include the reflection on these issues because they structure the very practice of curating. John Roberts, British aesthetician and Marxian theoretician, wrote in 2010 a paper, Curator as Producer. Already from the title, it is pretty evident that he draws heavy on Walter Benjamin's work on artist as producer, and he mentions the very details. I quote now: "Artist is a producer. He departs from traditional role of artist's relation to his material and his surrounding according to the rules of the trade, and becomes a critical instance in an extended division of technical and individual labor." End of quote. That means that from the traditional point of artist, who is the creator using his talents and his skills and uses those capacities to transform some material reality outside of himself and thus produces art, Benjamin suggests that it is no longer possible, and this is in the 1920s, for progressive artists to occupy this position. Benjamin suggests, and Roberts furthermore corroborates this in the case of curator. Curator is not anymore a person who only mediates arts that are or artworks that are produced by someone else. He is part of the wider system, part of the artistic apparatus, so to say, which produces on one side artworks, but on the other side curatorial knowledge. That is this type of self-reflection which is necessary for a particular theoretical field to come into being. What is important and what Roberts strongly stresses, and I find also particularly important, is that in this system of art production, artists and non-artists alike are included. So you don't have to have this expertise or the talent or the educational background in order to participate in the art field. The fact that contemporary curator or curator that deals with curatorial and not only with curating is forced to include non-artists alike and not non-experts alike opens up a whole new space for treating curatorial spheres. Because, as I said in the beginning when mentioning Zagreb's collective block, it includes people who don't have relations, at least not in the more narrow sense, with art, and include them into art production exactly by remodeling and reshuffling the traditional roles that are ascribed to the position of artist or of curator. This may be rather queer request, that is a request that can spoil or ruin the traditional roles in the curatorial field, but all the better. I think it is necessary for, especially for our curating in context program, that we treat all participants in the field as persons or as subjects with insufficient knowledge, ready to acquire new knowledge and ready to acquire it not only from the official stances like university professors or professional artists or curators, but also from the members who are in normal circumstances not instances of knowledge or instances of production of knowledge. That is, by inclusion of versatile social movements such as queer movements or feminist movements or support for migrants or support for disabled people. We, by including them into our production of knowledge, we expand this field of knowledge that is principally impossible from the strict standpoint of scholarly exegesis or of scholarly reflection as practice in academia and expert circles. Our point, or the main aim of our curating in context, is to develop theoretical and practical tools to empower and equip interested parties, that is students and general public alike, to grapple and to cope with the versatile problems that we come across into our everyday practice. The very fact that we treat this practice as a legitimate source of knowledge and not only as something to be treated as secondary, as merely cultural or so, it's a significant intervention, is a significant challenge, is a significant provocation for the pretty firm and stable academic establishment. By applying the problems of queer theory, which emerged on its meeting with Marxist theory, I think we can open at least some of the most relevant aspects of dealing minoritarian identities in a proper way and not in some structured, traditionally firm and stable ways. Thank you. That would be all.
Thank you very much, Goran. This was very inspiring. I have already, I don't know, something, some points or some questions also to engage you to discuss further. We'll see if we get any questions on our live stream in the meantime, so that we can engage the people that were watching us during your lecture. I would start with two things. The one is like maybe more or less theoretical, but the other would be like more concrete and practical in terms of examples and practices that you also pretty much are engaged with. The first is even in these examples when you were discussing Butler's disputes on the merely cultural, even in these examples when we start introducing the material into the conversation, I have the impression that it very often, like the justification when we have to make is related to just covering the economic factor, which is not something I, of course, consider to be not important. It is always implicated, and questions of capitalism and modes of production are definitely implicated in various cultural forms of production. But yeah, I think that eludes questions related to what Marx taught, but I think it is being neglected, but Marx included in his thought, is the concrete existential material aspects of also the cultural factors, including identities. And that includes our embodied lives, how different systems materially are embodied and experienced, how different worlds are being made and created through different cultural factors, cultural identities, or cultural practices, and how different possibilities are made viable and different possibilities are excluded, how certain paths are open and how certain paths are closed, how different emotional experience actually structure our managing and living through our lives, and how we can cope with different things, how we can, I don't know, get included in different practices of even survival in those terms, like, for example, intergenerational trauma, which comes with the racial question, which someone might consider to be a cultural question, but it is a very material to its very core, which interferes even with genetic material in people, and how this material dimension is also important. It is related to the concrete instead of to some idealistic and abstract thought or thinking, etc., etc. So that is my first, maybe if you have something to add on this. And my second question would be, how would you, for example, what you were talking about relate to, because there has been incredibly good queer cultural and art practice also happening in Croatia, where you come from, not only coming from, for example, the Queer Zagreb Festival and those practices, more art and cultural practice, but also queer activists in Zagreb have been engaged in different ways. So how would you reflect on on the practices activists and queer cultural workers are doing in Zagreb. What can we learn? What can we extrapolate from those experiences, for example, when thinking of these questions that you opened?
Okay, so the first one, I agree basically, because I mean, there's not much to disagree. This blindness of Marxism and critical theory to the material dimensions of queer lives, which was being neglected as merely cultural, is scandalous. Actually, you can't believe that there's been so much theoretical efforts through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and still in the late 90s, there are a significant group of people. Butler here stresses Nancy Fraser, which is a great theoretician, which is, I think, queer herself, which somehow manages not to see all these dimensions that you mentioned. That is that there are so much more beside the economy that is material, that structures and organizes everyday lives. I use here only this example of leisure by golf courses and bar or whatever, but you can see literally in every aspect of life, how are the households organized, what are the relations between friends, what are the relations between partners. These are not economic aspects that are regulated through capitalist logic, and that function on the exclusion of many parts of the society because of their non-normalcy. So when there is a pressing empirical issue still in Croatia, and I guess in Macedonia as well, and in different parts of Balkans or whatever post-Yugoslav spaces, the legal aspects of homosexual relationships. We do have this kind of what is called registered partnership. The title is stupid as it is, but basically it's a marriage between homosexual people. It doesn't have all the rights, it doesn't presuppose all the rights and all the tax benefits, all the inheritance law benefits, all the property laws benefits that is applied to the heterosexual people. So the very outcomes of some arrangements are discriminatory just based on this identitarian or cultural trait. The fact that you have a different sexual orientation means that you're discriminated according to so many aspects of social reproduction. That is, you cannot partake in inheritance law, you cannot, I don't know, you don't have the right to visit your heavily sick partner in the hospital or so. So this claim that only economy is material, that only industrial relations are material, and that all the other aspects are cultural is absolutely preposterous. And I think this is just some kind of traditional trope that is going to fade away. With younger generations, there's no chance that this is going to be a relevant topic. I guess, and from my experience when speaking with colleagues and with younger people, no one sticks within the critical theory to this kind of orthodoxy, old Marxist orthodoxy. And this is a good tendency, and I think it's getting really good. I haven't read paper in 20 years that would be strict, well, maybe I have, but they're really in minority, which claim that queer issues are not material, or that they are just something that affects rather unimportant aspects of someone's lives. According to the second question, as you said, the Zagreb Queer Festival is pretty impressive, especially in these times of austerity or something, because it manages, due to the fundraising capacities and talents of the main curators, Zvonimir Doborovic, as you may well know. No matter what I think about the particular aspects of these programs, they manage to be a relevant part of Zagreb independent culture with relevant and serious international impact. Unlike the traditional and well-established and well publicly funded, like Museum of Contemporary Art, which has like millions of euros per year, and are not able to produce even the slightest intervention into this European dynamic, let's say so. Queer programs, and not only within Queer Festival, but also some other independent groups or theater companies or even more so dense companies, manage to tackle the issues of queer problems and manage to communicate on the international level, not just by the mere fact of being international, that is included people from other spheres, but to treat problems that affect young, or not necessarily young, but that affect people in the same or analogous way in Netherlands, in England, or in Argentina, or whatever. So this universality, and exactly the universality was the aspect that was always neglected. They say, okay, queer theory may be pretty well developed, but basically you don't stick to the universal. You're not capable of doing and seeing and articulating systematic insights. These are only particular. And exactly this particular perspective from the vantage point of artistic practices and curatorial practice in Croatia is the most internationalist, that is most universal, so to say. This, I hope this at least highlights some of the aspects of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Super. So we have very little time left, but I would also like to get on one more question, which is important to the way you are trying to develop the concept and the problem of queerness. So also in relation to capitalism. One of the major older arguments actually was trying to link questions of gender and sexuality to capitalist exploitation through the problem of reproduction, of the nuclear family and heterosexuality as the major point for these problems of reproduction and the nuclear family. But nowadays it is more than clear, and I think we all know that even gay rights issues or women's issues have been pretty well incorporated into capitalist and especially into neoliberal capitalist logic. So maybe one of the points that we can also I don't know, not for me to point that, but maybe we can somehow close also this discussion, is that queerness opens this question to go beyond just this classical identitarian and inclusionary aspect of the problem, either of gender or sexuality, but because there are still also non-normative gender and sexual practices that are heavily excluded from capitalist forms of exploitation or normalization, and which cannot be strictly related to just to the rainbow umbrella of LGBT, but that still bear the potential for critique both of normative gender and sexual system, but also to capitalist system and its imposition of certain limits and forms of exploitation. So I think that this expansion of the concept of queer, which can definitely be related both to this distinction, let's say LGBT queer, politics, political, and curating, curatorial, as some analogies of these critical binaries that you employed, something that I think can be a fruitful thought for further thinking and discussion. I don't know if you have something to maybe add on this.
Well, I like this really linguistic definition of queer as not normal, because it includes all the non-normal practices and experiences and knowledges which are not still included into the mainstream. There are so many aspects, as you mentioned, that are still not legitimate to talk about in a decent circles. One of those is definitely a sexual pleasure. As Preciado points in many of his texts, it is this kind of prohibition of anus. I think it's the title of a paper or something like this. The fact that it is prescribed as something which is tolerated but is not normal. We still know what is normal, and that is the usual intercourse, I don't know, heterosexual intercourse. The fact that we treat this still as marginal or as something somehow disruptive is the marker that this traditional and normal reflexive position is still very dominant, even within the spheres of liberal academia, even within the spheres of, I don't know, very open and tolerant circles of American academic left or European liberal intelligentsia or something. We are still not capable of treating some aspects of sexuality as normally legitimate parts of human actions and reflection about human actions. One of the interesting thing was, I think, in 2016, when the journal Porn Studies was established, there was strong opposition in academic circles because pornography is something irrelevant, something not decent enough to be treated academically. And yet we know that aside from the economic algorithms, the pornographic algorithms on the web are the most used ones. So it's a big part of human experience on everyday level, and still this is one of the queer parts. Possibly it doesn't still deserve, from the mainstream point of view, the same legitimate part as the normal sexualities. It is probably always be the case. Some of the practices will be minoritarian and questionable and provocative and disturbing, even in perspective of 100 years or so, but this is not the reason not to include them or not to treat them with seriousness and theoretical dignity as they deserve. Many questions that are now common sense, that is like sexual identity of homosexual people who were absolutely erroneous and scandalous in 60s, are nowadays normal and legitimate. So in this hope, we may work in this perspective to open as much as possible theoretical field or theoretical space for articulating as much as possible different and differential sexual and all other identities, in order, which basically nowadays question this normality of the mainstream academia, mainstream thought.
Super, totally, yeah. Okay, because the summer school curating context has another talk which is part of the program, and we would have to wrap to close this lecture. I would like to thank Goran for being with us today, being part of the school, but also being part of the festival. Something which I hope in what we are doing is managing to at least to a certain degree make these critical and political interventions on different levels. We are continuing also with the festival tomorrow with the program, when we have a performance at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Dragon a Capone by the dance trio Steam Room, just for the audience. And yes, my gratitude once again for in my name, but also of Lokomotiva, and I hope that we'll manage to see each other soon in life after this heavy times end. So,
I hope so. Thank you again. Thank you, Biljana. It was a pleasure to participate in this program. So see you. And this is it. Bye.
Have a good day, Goran. Bye.
Thank you as well.
Bye.